I remember the first time I saw them glowing in the Mariana Trench, their pale blue lights pulsing like tiny silent warnings. I shouldn't have reached out, but curiosity made my fingers tremble toward the bioluminescent creatures, and that's when I learned there were 11 rules we had to follow to survive down here. Each rule felt stranger than the last, almost like they were written by someone or something that had seen the depths long before us. My partner scoffed at the rules, daring me to ignore them, and that's when everything started going wrong. Now, I don't know which of us will make it through the night, and I still can't answer one question: what's really watching from the shadows? The first time I saw them glowing, I could hardly look away. My fingers hovered inches from the soft, flickering lights, the thrill of discovery battling the sinking dread in my chest. I remembered Rule 1 as a faint voice in my mind, warning me not to interfere, but my partner laughed, reaching for one as if daring the darkness itself. "They're just little lights," he said, smirking. "Nothing to worry about." I wanted to agree, but some instinct rooted in the depths screamed at me to pull back. As I backed away, the currents around us shifted strangely, stirring clouds of sediment that made the trench floor seem alive. The bioluminescent creatures pulsed faster, as if sensing our presence, sending ribbons of faint blue light across the void. I felt a pressure in my chest, a tightness that wasn't just from the suit or depth. "I told you not to," I whispered, but he shrugged, joking that I was overreacting. Yet, in the corner of my mask, I swore I saw something move against the light, a shape that didn't belong. We continued deeper, following the mapped path through the Mariana Trench, but the glow seemed to follow us now, always just out of reach. I kept thinking about Rule 1, about how fragile and dangerous these creatures could be, how touching them wasn't just forbidden, it could provoke the trench itself. My partner argued, saying that rules were just superstition from old divers, but the pulse of the lights grew stronger whenever we neared, as though they were warning us. Something about the rhythm made my stomach churn, a low hum that I felt more than heard. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and I began to notice the subtle changes in the water. Shadows stretched where no shadows should exist, the silhouettes of the creatures flickering unnaturally against the rocky walls. My partner joked again, "Maybe they like me better than you," and reached out, brushing a luminescent tendril with his glove. The moment he did, the trench shifted. Rocks above us tumbled softly at first, then heavier debris slid, bumping against our submersible like a warning. My heart pounded, and I whispered urgently, "We shouldn't have," but the words caught in my throat. I tried to convince him to move back, to respect what I now understood as a fragile ecosystem far beyond our comprehension. He laughed, brushing it off, but the creatures pulsed faster, their glow now irregular, like a heartbeat gone mad. I realized Rule 1 wasn't just about safety, it was about survival. One wrong move here, one touch, and the trench didn't forgive. A sudden ripple of motion near the ledge made me jump. I wasn't alone. Something or someone was watching. The trench grew darker as we moved further, the faint blue lights flickering against the black abyss, revealing shapes that defied understanding. My partner's bravado began to falter when a long shadow slid past the submersible, just beyond the reach of our lights. "Did you see that?" he whispered, voice tight. I nodded but didn't speak, afraid that any sound might provoke whatever lurked in the darkness. Rule 1 resonated in my mind again, not as a suggestion, but as a warning that had been carved into the very pressure of the water around us. Suddenly, one of the creatures drifted too close to the hull, and my partner reached out reflexively. I grabbed his arm, heart racing. The water around it seemed to shiver, almost sentient, and the faint light of the creature splintered into shards that danced violently against the walls. My partner froze, his face pale behind the mask, finally understanding that some rules weren't meant to be questioned. I whispered, "I told you, never touch them," and the trench answered with a low rolling vibration that made every bone in my body ache. We floated in silence, the creatures retreating just enough to reveal the shadows moving beyond them. Something massive was down there, something that had watched divers before us, something that measured each heartbeat. My partner refused to speak, eyes wide, and I clutched the controls, trying to steady the submersible. I realized that Rule 1 was not only about touching the creatures, it was about recognizing our place, about respecting an order far older and colder than humanity. Every flicker of blue light felt like a pulse against my chest, reminding me how fragile we were. The longer we stayed, the more I noticed the subtle distortions in the water, the way the trench seemed to fold in on itself, revealing pathways and voids that didn't exist on our maps. I could feel the creatures' glow bending unnaturally, creating illusions that made me question my own senses. My partner tried to laugh, but it was hollow, shaking. "Maybe we should turn back," he muttered finally, but the current already pushed us deeper, like the trench had claimed us. I knew that breaking Rule 1 even once had invited this, and I prayed we could survive long enough to see sunlight again. By the time we reached what should have been a safe plateau, the water was thick with floating spores of light, remnants of the creatures disturbed by our presence. The trench seemed alive in ways I couldn't explain, twisting and bending, reflecting our lights in impossible angles. My partner refused to move, staring into the abyss, whispering, "I think it knows we're here." And I realized the weight of Rule 1, that touching, or even provoking these creatures, wasn't just dangerous, it might have alerted something else entirely. Finally, as we prepared to ascend slightly, a shadow flickered across the controls, something moving far too fast to be a creature, too deliberate to be current. My hands froze on the console, heart hammering. I thought back to Rule 1 one last time, knowing that it wasn't about fear, it was about survival. And then, just as I reached to adjust the lights, a ripple across the water's surface signaled the first real warning. Something massive was awake, and it was hungry. The moment the shadow passed across our controls, I remembered Rule 2, a rule that had sounded almost trivial in the briefings, but now felt like a lifeline. My hands hovered over the console, hesitant to move, knowing that any bright flare could draw attention from something far larger than us. "We can't just sit here," my partner whispered, voice tight. "We have to see where it's going." I shook my head, feeling the panic rise, but the urge to follow, to understand the movement, gnawed at me like a predator circling prey. Every mapped path we had was meaningless here, the darkness pressing around us like a living thing. The submersible crept forward cautiously, our dim lights barely slicing through the inky black water. Shadows lurked in every crevice, flickers of movement that made me question my eyes, my sanity. I kept reminding myself of Rule 2, forcing my gaze back onto the safe paths, ignoring the curiosity that screamed to investigate. My partner, restless and impatient, murmured under his breath, "We're too blind to survive down here." I tried to reason with him, explaining that rules weren't just bureaucracy, they were survival, but his eyes betrayed a growing disbelief, a desire to break boundaries he didn't understand. We drifted over a plateau of jagged rock, barely visible in the faint glow of the submersible's core lights. The trench stretched beyond any of our maps, and I could see the pulse of strange creatures moving in the shadows, some almost imperceptibly close. I reminded myself silently that Rule 2 existed because the unknown wasn't passive, it reacted. We were intruders, trespassers in a world that didn't care for human rules. My partner's hand twitched toward the spotlight, a flicker of rebellion in his movement, and I grabbed it, whispering, "Please don't. We can't know what's out there." As we hovered, currents shifted violently, tugging at the submersible, making the lights dance across the walls. Shapes appeared at the periphery, elongated and inhuman, moving with intent. I could feel the temperature drop subtly, a creeping chill that the lights couldn't reach. My partner scoffed nervously. "It's just the pressure," but I saw the reflection in his mask, the pulse of something watching. My mind kept returning to Rule 2, realizing that the mapped boundaries were not just lines on a chart, they were fences keeping whatever lurked beyond from noticing us too soon. A soft ripple moved beneath us, like a shadow skimming over the trench floor, almost imperceptible until it shifted the sediment in a slow wave. I gripped the console, heart hammering. I had to keep reminding myself why Rule 2 existed. Shining lights carelessly could turn curiosity into disaster. My partner leaned closer to the viewport, straining to see what I feared, whispering, "I just need one look." The moment those words left his mouth, I felt the water around us pulse, a pressure wave that wasn't natural. Something had reacted to the smallest hint of light. I struggled to maintain control of the submersible, the shadow below moving faster now, closer, almost teasing. I told him again, if we break Rule 2, even a little, we don't know what will come. His skepticism wavered, fear creeping into his eyes as the faint glow of our lights revealed glimpses of enormous sinuous shapes threading through the abyss. I could feel the trench closing in mentally, every mapped line I had memorized now seeming fragile, inadequate. The rule wasn't arbitrary, it was a boundary between life and being consumed. Time slowed as we hovered on the edge of mapped territory, the pulse of the trench echoing in our suits. My partner's hand twitched again toward the spotlight, but I gripped it, shaking. The shapes in the darkness writhed like liquid shadows, reacting to the faintest hint of illumination. I thought about the briefings, the warnings that now seemed laughably mild in retrospect. Rule 2 was not just about staying safe, it was about respect, acknowledging the abyss as an entity with memory and intent. Breaking it would be an invitation we might never survive. A sudden shift in the current caused a debris cloud to rise, obscuring the trench floor entirely. The glowing creatures we'd tried to avoid touching now drifted erratically, as if warning us, pulsing in sharp, irregular bursts. I could feel my partner's panic, his face pressed against the viewport. "Maybe it's not dangerous," he whispered shakily. "Maybe it just wants," but I cut him off, gripping his arm. Rule 2 flashed in my mind again. Any unnecessary light beyond what we knew could provoke the unknown. We drifted silently, the submersible rocking slightly in the uneven currents, lights dimmed to a whisper. Shapes flickered at the edges, enormous and silent, moving with a precision that suggested intelligence, predatory awareness. I could hear my own breathing amplified in the suit, each exhale sharp and fearful. The mapped boundaries felt almost spiritual now, lines drawn, not by cartographers, but by something older, something patient. I couldn't shake the feeling that every uncharted inch we saw could hide the end of us. Finally, a ripple brushed the submersible from below, something long and powerful, brushing our hull before retreating into the abyss. I swallowed hard, realizing that even within mapped territory, the trench demanded respect. My partner's eyes widened, and he no longer questioned the rules, no longer joked. He had seen the consequences of curiosity in ways I could not fully describe. I knew then, as the trench hummed around us, that Rule 2 wasn't just guidance, it was a lifeline, and stepping beyond it even once might seal our fate. We held position, the darkness pressing from every angle, the faint glow of the creatures pulsing like distant warnings. I whispered to myself, "Stay within the boundaries, stay within the boundaries." My partner sat quietly, watching, finally understanding that our survival depended on restraint. Just as I allowed myself a brief exhale of relief, the shadows at the edge of our lights shifted again, faster, deliberate, and larger than anything we'd seen. Something was moving, something that hadn't been accounted for in any chart or rulebook, and I knew our next move would decide everything. The shadow beneath us had retreated just enough to make me think we could move, but my hand stayed frozen on the controls. I remembered Rule 3 then, like a lifeline tethering me to reality, never separate from my partner, or the abyss would consume us both. My partner's curiosity flared again, and he muttered, "Maybe if I go alone I can see it better." But I grabbed his arm instinctively, heart hammering, "We can't. You don't understand what's down there." The trench had a way of testing rules one by one, and I had a sinking feeling we were next. We drifted cautiously, every meter feeling like an eternity. The trench shifted around us, currents tugging at the submersible, and I kept reminding myself of Rule 3, clinging to the need for unity. My partner's bravado faltered as shapes swirled in the darkness. glimpses of enormous forms that defied description. "I thought I could handle it," he whispered, voice tight with fear, "but this is too much." I nodded silently, gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity, knowing that even a moment of separation could be fatal in this cold, crushing world. The water grew thicker with suspended debris, glowing creatures darting erratically, as though anticipating our moves. We tried to maneuver through the narrow chasms, our lights cutting jagged paths across the walls. I glanced at my partner and saw a flicker of defiance in his eyes. He wanted to explore, to break free, but the way the abyss responded to our every motion reminded me why Rule 3 existed. If one of us strayed, there would be no rescue, no warning. The trench would simply claim what it wanted, leaving the other to drown in isolation. A sudden surge of current slammed us against a jagged wall, jolting both of us violently. The submersible's lights flickered, casting monstrous shadows across the trench walls. "We should split up," my partner blurted, trying to reach a control to adjust the lights. But I grabbed him firmly. I whispered, "No, remember Rule 3, we stay together." The trench seemed to press closer, its darkness alive, testing whether we could follow the rules, or whether our curiosity would doom us. Every moment apart felt like a heartbeat, closer to disaster. As we navigated deeper, the shapes around us multiplied, elongated shadows twisting in impossible angles. I could see the subtle changes in the water pressure, the way the current seemed almost sentient, guiding us, warning us, threatening us. My partner's face was pale, jaw tight, and I realized that his earlier skepticism was gone, replaced by raw fear. "You were right," he said quietly. "Staying together, it's the only way." I nodded, but deep down, I knew that Rule 3 was more than just survival. It was the only tether keeping our sanity intact against the crushing isolation of the abyss. Hours seemed to stretch like days, and I felt exhaustion creeping into my limbs. We were forced to follow the mapped path, currents whipping violently, creatures brushing close enough that I could feel the pressure from their movement. My partner's hand never left mine, and I silently thanked him for it. If he had broken Rule 3, I shuddered to think what might have happened. The trench was patient, waiting for the moment when we might falter, for a single split-second separation to allow the darkness to claim one of us. A low vibration ran through the submersible, sending shivers through my entire body. I could hear nothing beyond our own breathing, the rhythm of our hearts pounding in unison. The shapes lurking just beyond our lights, twisted unnaturally, their presence unnerving and deliberate. I whispered, "Stay close, don't let go," but my words barely pierced the tension. The abyss seemed to sense that we were fragile, that we were testing the rules, and I could feel its attention shifting from the creatures to us, waiting for the first sign of weakness. The trench walls narrowed suddenly, forcing us to navigate through a jagged, narrow canyon. My partner's foot nudged a control by accident, sending a beam of light flickering into the darkness beyond the map boundary. Immediately, something reacted. A ripple ran along the water, and I gripped his arm tighter, heart hammering. "I told you," I muttered, realizing that Rule 3 wasn't just about staying together. It was about mutual survival in a world where a single misstep could erase one of us without warning. The pressure of the trench pressed against us from all sides. A moment of silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of our submersible. Shadows twisted and writhed just beyond the lights, and the glow of distant creatures intensified, like warning signals. My partner exhaled shakily, finally accepting that the abyss demanded compliance. I could feel a presence, watching, weighing our every motion. I realized that the consequences of separating weren't theoretical. They were immediate, tangible, and merciless. Even holding hands wasn't enough to shake the sense of looming danger that filled the trench. Suddenly, a flash of motion darted across the canyon, far faster than anything we'd seen before. My partner flinched, and I instinctively pulled him closer, reminding myself once more of Rule 3. The creature, or whatever it was, slid past us, leaving a trail of displaced water that felt like ice against my skin. It was deliberate, aware, And I knew then that the trench didn't just punish separation, it used it to toy with you, to test whether you would break. Every pulse of the water, every flicker of shadow, reminded me that we were merely guests in a world that didn't negotiate. By the time we emerged from the canyon, our submersible battered and trembling, the trench seemed to settle slightly, though the darkness remained absolute. My partner's face was pale, eyes wide, and I knew he understood now. Rule 3 wasn't negotiable. Even a moment's hesitation, a second of curiosity, could have meant one of us lost forever. We continued forward, hands tightly linked, aware that the rules were the only thing standing between us and the unfathomable abyss. Just as I allowed myself a tentative sigh, a distant ripple moved across the trench floor, deliberate and ominous. Something was watching, and I knew the next choice we made could decide our fate. As we drifted cautiously past the canyon, I remembered Rule 4, a rule that had always sounded like a precaution until now. The current slowed for a moment, and I realized the danger of staying still. The trench seemed almost alive, sensing hesitation. My partner, exhausted and trembling, whispered, "Maybe we can rest here for a bit." I shook my head, gripping the controls tightly. No, even a second too long could draw attention. We move now. The shadows in the periphery flickered, elongating and twisting, as if the trench itself was testing us, waiting for the first lapse in motion. We continued forward, each movement deliberate, yet our hearts pounded, as if echoing through the water. I felt the trench pressing closer, subtle currents nudging the submersible toward jagged walls, almost like it was hurting us. My partner struggled with panic, asking, "Do we have to keep moving forever?" I swallowed hard, knowing that Rule 4 existed because any delay could cost lives. The creatures glimmered faintly, flickering faster, as if to remind us that lingering drew the gaze of something far larger, something patient and hungry. A ripple of displaced water brushed past the submersible, barely noticeable at first, then growing stronger with every heartbeat. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark walls, measuring the rhythm of the currents, knowing that stopping even briefly could make us visible to the unseen observers. My partner's fingers twitched near the light controls, tempted to flash a glance into the darkness, but I pressed his hands down. "If we linger, we're dead," I said softly, repeating Rule 4 in my mind, trying to convince both him and myself that movement was our only protection against the abyss. The deeper we went, the more the trench seemed to respond to our presence. Shadows that had once stayed distant now brushed the edges of our lights, almost playful, almost testing. I could see my partner struggling to hold back curiosity, to resist stopping to stare at the strange shapes writhing in the abyss. I gripped his shoulder, whispering again about Rule 4, and this time he didn't argue. He understood instinctively that lingering was more than dangerous. It was an invitation to be watched, to be drawn into the unknown. The weight of the trench pressed around us, cold and calculating. The water thickened, suspended particles catching our lights in chaotic bursts, revealing glimpses of massive forms, shifting just beyond perception. Every second spent analyzing the shadows made me want to turn back, to rest, but I remembered the consequences outlined in Rule 4. The trench didn't forgive hesitation. Currents nudged us unnervingly, teasing the edges of the submersible, as if measuring our resolve. My partner whispered that he could feel something brushing past the hull, and I had no words, only the reminder that movement was our lifeline. A sudden jolt pushed us sideways as debris fell from the upper walls, tiny rocks and sediment dancing through our dim lights. I realized we had slowed too much, just for a fraction of a second, and the trench had noticed. My partner's face was pale as he muttered, "I think it knows we're here." I nodded silently, hands steady on the controls, feeling a pressure unlike anything from the depth, a weight in the water that seemed aware of our hesitation. Rule 4 wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a barrier between life and the unfathomable darkness around us. We maneuvered through a narrow passage, the walls closing in like a tunnel of shadows, currents twisting violently around the submersible. The faint glow of distant creatures pulsed erratically, almost frantic, as if warning us to keep moving. My partner tried to focus, but I could see his hands trembling, his body aching for pause. "I can't keep going," he whispered, and I realized that the rule was testing us both, patience and endurance against an abyss that would not forgive. I tightened my grip, silently urging him forward, knowing that a single pause could turn curiosity into catastrophe. The creatures we had been avoiding glimmered closer, weaving through the currents around us in strange, unpredictable patterns. Shadows flickered along the trench walls, massive and deliberate, forcing us to navigate carefully. My partner gasped as a shape darted just beyond the light, moving far faster than expected, and I reminded myself again of Rule 4, lingering even a heartbeat too long could reveal us completely. The trench had a memory, a sense of intent, and our survival depended entirely on respecting its rules, no matter how unnatural or terrifying they seemed. As we pressed forward, the passage opened into a wider plateau, but I didn't dare slow down. The creature's light pulsed faintly, almost in rhythm with my own heartbeat, and I realized the trench measured hesitation like a predator measures fear. My partner's bravado had completely vanished, replaced with a silent obedience born of terror. I whispered under my breath, "Do not stop," repeating the lesson of Rule 4, knowing that any deviation could attract attention from something far more dangerous than the flickering shapes around us. Finally, we reached a section that appeared mapped, a plateau where the water seemed calmer, and yet I couldn't relax. The trench had tested us, nudged us, and reminded us why rules existed beyond human comprehension. My partner's breathing was ragged, sweat slick on his forehead inside the suit, and he finally admitted, "I understand. We can't stop." I nodded, but the moment was brief. A ripple of movement far below the plateau suggested that something enormous had been following us all along, waiting, and I realized with sinking dread that the next choice we made could decide everything. As we adjusted to the plateau, my eyes caught a glint in the sediment below, something metallic partially buried, and I immediately recalled Rule 5. The brief shimmer made my fingers itch to reach out, curiosity clawing at me, but instinct screamed restraint. My partner leaned closer, his mask fogging slightly, whispering, "Maybe it's just debris, something we can check quickly." I shook my head firmly, gripping the console. No, Rule 5 exists for a reason. Touching unknown objects can trigger things we can't predict. The trench seemed to pulse with awareness, as if it knew we were debating its boundaries. The object remained half hidden in the darkness, a faint reflection of our submersible's lights catching the corner of my eye. I could feel my partner's impatience growing, a twitch in his hand toward the controls. I reminded myself silently why Rule 5 wasn't trivial. Objects left in the trench weren't abandoned by accident. They were warnings, remnants, or worse, traps set by the depths themselves. The water around us thickened subtly, debris drifting closer, as if nudged by invisible hands, reminding me of the weight behind every rule. "We can't interact," I said again, voice steady, trying to keep panic from rising. We continued forward, keeping the submersible just above the sediment, careful not to disturb the glinting object. My partner muttered, "It's probably safe, we're being ridiculous." But I felt a pressure in the water, subtle yet unmistakable, like the trench was testing our compliance. I glanced down, seeing shadows twist unnaturally around the metallic glimmer, forming shapes that didn't belong. The creatures we'd seen earlier pulsed nervously, their light flickering in a pattern I couldn't decode. I repeated Rule 5 in my mind, understanding that even a second's curiosity could set off consequences far beyond our control. A slow current pushed us closer to the plateau's edge, and the metallic object seemed to shift slightly under the water, as if acknowledging our presence. My partner froze, eyes wide, realizing the potential danger, but he still whispered, "What if we just touch it for a second?" I gripped his arm, the cold steel of the controls biting into my palms. "Even a second is too long," I said, heart hammering. The trench had a way of punishing hesitation or disobedience subtly, and I felt the first ripple of unease crawl along my spine. As we moved past the object, something shifted in the water behind us. A distortion, a ripple that wasn't caused by currents. I realized immediately that Rule 5 wasn't just about physical interaction. It was about acknowledging the presence of things we didn't understand and leaving them alone. My partner's face paled, his bravado completely gone, and he whispered, "It moved. Didn't it?" I nodded grimly, knowing that the trench had noticed our attention, and the consequences might follow us farther than we could see. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down in the silence. The plateau narrowed, forcing us to navigate through a canyon littered with similar metallic shards and debris. Each one seemed ordinary at first glance, but I knew better. The trench had left them deliberately, like markers or warnings. I could feel my partner's curiosity struggling against fear, his hand twitching toward the nearest glint. I pressed his arm gently against the console, silently invoking Rule 5, willing him to understand without words. The water around us rippled again, as though the trench itself was testing our obedience. A sudden jolt threw us slightly against the canyon walls, and sediment clouds billowed around the submersible. One of the metallic fragments seemed to pulse in the dim light, a reflection that was almost alive. My partner gasped, stepping back instinctively, and I whispered, "Do not touch it." Rule 5 had saved lives before. It was a silent promise that following it gave us a chance, and I felt the truth of that promise in the trembling water surrounding us. Something had moved in response to our presence, and I wasn't ready to discover what would happen if we ignored it. We pressed onward, navigating carefully, each shadow now carrying weight, each glimmer of reflected light making my pulse accelerate. I kept the submersible's trajectory steady, eyes scanning constantly, aware that any deviation could bring disaster. My partner finally swallowed his fear and nodded silently, realizing that compliance wasn't weakness, it was survival. The trench seemed to settle slightly as we left the object behind, but I knew the calm was temporary. Farther along, something shifted in the darkness ahead, elongated and moving deliberately in a way that suggested intelligence. My partner whispered, voice trembling, "Do you think it followed us?" I didn't answer immediately, too focused on maintaining control of the submersible. Rule 5 flashed in my mind again, the weight of its second warning unmistakable. Interaction wasn't limited to touch. It extended to acknowledgement, attention, and the act of curiosity itself. The trench remembered everything. By the time we reached what appeared to be a mapped corridor of safety, my hands ached from holding the controls so tightly. My partner's breathing was shallow, every exhale loud inside the suit. I realized then that the trench had been testing us the entire time, presenting objects and challenges to measure our compliance. I whispered under my breath, hoping the darkness wouldn't hear, "We didn't touch anything. We survived." But as I allowed myself a fraction of relief, a shadow surged from the canyon below, massive, deliberate, and moving faster than anything we had ever seen. I knew then that the trench had noticed, and the consequences of Rule 5 might not yet be over. As the shadow surged past the canyon below, I felt a subtle vibration in the submersible, a pull in the water that made my stomach knot, and I immediately remembered Rule 6. The currents weren't just random, they carried intent. Guiding or warning and ignoring them could be fatal. My partner leaned over the console, frowning. "It's probably just turbulence," he muttered, but I shook my head, voice low. "No, this is different. The trench tells us through pressure, and we ignore it at our own risk." Every pulse of water around us made me uneasy, like the trench was alive, aware and testing us. The submersible creaked slightly under the changing currents, and the dim light reflected off jagged rock walls in disorienting angles. I could feel the pull of the water shifting unpredictably, nudging us toward narrow passages and unseen crevices. My partner's skepticism wavered as he realized the strength of these invisible forces. "I feel it too," he admitted, voice trembling. I nodded silently, knowing that Rule 6 wasn't about comfort. It was about recognizing that every minor change in the trench could signal life, danger, or death lurking nearby. The abyss around us felt alive with unseen intention. We adjusted our trajectory, trying to maintain stability against the subtle but deliberate currents. Shadows stretched and twisted across the walls, sometimes disappearing entirely, only to reappear moments later in impossible configurations. My partner's eyes darted nervously, and I whispered, "Never ignore the currents. Rule 6 exists for a reason." The trench seemed to respond to our compliance, the pull easing slightly, then intensifying as if testing our attentiveness. I realized that these pressures weren't just physical. They were a language of the abyss, one that punished negligence harshly. The deeper we went, the more the currents seemed purposeful, directing us past clusters of glowing creatures that pulsed erratically. I could feel a presence moving along with us, invisible but undeniable, nudging us in ways that made every second a challenge. My partner muttered, "Maybe it's trying to guide us," but I wasn't convinced. I reminded myself silently of Rule 6, understanding that any deviation from the current's subtle directions could draw attention from forces we couldn't see. Compliance here was survival, negligence a death sentence. Suddenly, a stronger pull tugged at the submersible, forcing us toward a narrow chasm lined with jagged rocks. My partner gasped, struggling to stabilize the craft. "We need to fight it," he said urgently, but I shook my head, whispering, "No, we follow it." I realized then that the currents weren't random obstacles. They were deliberate warnings, guiding us through the trench in a way that maximized our chance of survival. Ignoring them wasn't just foolish, it was suicidal, a fact the trench made painfully clear with every surge and pull. As we moved through the chasm, I noticed the water pressure fluctuating in subtle waves against the hull, vibrations that seemed to mimic a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. My partner's hands trembled over the controls, and I gripped his arm to steady him. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. I nodded, knowing that Rule 6 demanded not only attention, but respect for every slight anomaly. One misread signal could push us into a trap, a crevice, or a predator's path. The trench didn't forgive errors, and I felt that awareness pressing in from all sides. A cloud of suspended sediment rose ahead, stirred by currents that seemed intelligent, pushing us toward a cavern barely visible in the dim glow. Shapes flickered within it, elongated shadows that twisted unnaturally, moving in ways no natural predator should. My partner leaned closer, voice tight. "Should we go back?" I shook my head, whispering, "No, we follow the currents. We do exactly what Rule 6 says." The trench seemed to pulse around us, as though aware of our hesitation, testing whether we would comply or defy it. The submersible tilted slightly as the pressure shifted again, currents tugging us sideways in a deliberate, almost playful motion. My heart hammered against my chest as I guided us forward, careful not to resist the water's flow. My partner's voice trembled. It's like it knows we're scared." I nodded grimly, silently agreeing. The subtle fluctuations weren't mere physical phenomena. They were warnings, indicators of unseen intelligence, and a reminder that neglecting Rule 6 could provoke consequences beyond comprehension. We entered a narrow tunnel, currents whirling more aggressively, almost herding us towards something I couldn't yet see. Glimpses of the glowing creatures streaked past our lights, moving unnaturally, their pulses quickened as if aware of the unseen eyes that followed us. My partner's skepticism had completely vanished. He stayed silent, following my lead as I guided us through. Every fluctuation in pressure felt like a test, every tug of the water a subtle reprimand, and I realized that ignoring these signs even once could make the difference between survival and death. Finally, the currents eased slightly as we emerged into a small plateau, though the water still vibrated subtly against the submersible. My partner exhaled shakily, finally acknowledging the importance of the rules we had taken lightly until now. I glanced at the shadows, lingering at the edge of the lights, and whispered to myself, "Never ignore the currents." The pressure shifts had been deliberate, purposeful, and I knew that what waited just beyond this plateau would test our compliance with Rule 6 in ways we weren't ready to face. As we drifted past the plateau, I caught a faint flicker in the distance and immediately remembered Rule 7, the one I had almost forgotten in the tension of Rule 6. The creature's glow pulsed like tiny warnings, and I felt a strange pull, as if the abyss itself wanted me to stare. My partner squinted, voice hushed and uneasy. "Do we have to look away?" I nodded, gripping the controls tightly. "Yes, Rule 7 exists, because what you see can change everything. Don't look." The creatures shimmered, some hovering just beyond the lights, and the pressure of the trench felt almost sentient around us. The submersible moved carefully, shadows of the creatures flickering across the walls, their lights oscillating in patterns that were mesmerizing and terrifying. My partner's hands trembled as he tried to keep his gaze forward, but his curiosity was palpable. "It's like they're calling to me," he whispered, voice barely audible over the hum of the submersible. I pressed my hands against the console, whispering again, reminding myself that Rule 7 wasn't about fear. It was about survival. One glance could unravel your perception, make the abyss itself aware of your presence. The deeper we went, the more the creature's glow seemed to shift, brightening and dimming almost in response to our movement. I could feel the submersible rocking slightly in the currents, shadows stretching in impossible ways across the trench walls. My partner leaned closer, whispering, "I think it's following us." I swallowed hard, adjusting the lights to minimize reflection. Every pulse of light felt deliberate, almost predatory, and I realized that Rule 7 wasn't just about avoiding visual contact. It was about refusing to engage with whatever consciousness might lurk behind those glowing eyes. Suddenly, a long, thin shape slipped past our lights, weaving among the creatures with unnatural grace. My partner flinched, shivering. "Do they see us?" he whispered, voice tight. I pressed a hand against his shoulder, refusing to let him turn toward the glow. The trench was alive in ways beyond comprehension, and I understood that looking directly into those bioluminescent eyes could anchor our presence in ways we couldn't undo. Each pulse of light now felt like a heartbeat, an unspoken message that the abyss was aware of every decision we made. We continued through the narrow canyon, the creature's glow flickering eerily in the dim light. Shadows twisted along the walls, elongated and moving in ways that defied physics. My partner's eyes darted repeatedly toward the shimmering forms, curiosity and fear battling in his gaze. I pressed my hands firmly on his arm, whispering, "Do not look. Remember Rule 7. The water around us vibrated subtly, as if aware of our hesitation, nudging us forward while warning us simultaneously. It was a reminder that even a single glance could invite consequences we weren't prepared to face. The submersible drifted further, and I could feel the tension in the water increase. The creature's glow grew more erratic, flickering in pulses that seemed to mimic our own breathing. My partner whispered shakily, "They're communicating, aren't they?" I shook my head, gripping the controls tightly. Rule 7 flashed in my mind, the warning clear: to look directly into those eyes was to acknowledge something older and far more intelligent than ourselves. I realized that even as we obeyed, the trench itself was testing our restraint, our fear, our compliance. A sudden surge of current pushed us sideways, sending the submersible rocking slightly, and the shadows danced violently across the walls. One creature hovered close, its glow brighter than any we'd seen, almost hypnotic. My partner's eyes flicked toward it involuntarily, and I grabbed his shoulder, whispering fiercely, "Do not look." Rule 7. The momentary glance made my stomach knot, a cold chill crawling up my spine. I could feel the trench responding, currents twisting, as if the abyss itself was aware we had almost broken the rule. We navigated through a narrow canyon, creatures weaving above and below in flickering light. Every pulse felt deliberate, and the shadows cast by the submersible danced like something alive. My partner's breathing became ragged as he fought the urge to stare, and I could feel my own resolve wavering. The trench seemed to hum, subtle vibrations under the hull, warning us that rules weren't just arbitrary, They were survival mechanisms against awareness we could not comprehend. I reminded myself of Rule 7 once more, silently, to steel my focus against a hypnotic glow. The creature's glow shifted again, brighter, pulsing almost rhythmically, as if measuring our compliance. My partner's face was pale behind the mask, eyes wide, and he whispered, "I can't stop noticing them." I shook my head, pressing a hand to his arm, guiding him through the canyon. The trench felt alive, pressing in, the weight of the abyss like a living presence that didn't forgive hesitation. Even a momentary glance could mark us, anchor us, and I realized that obeying Rule 7 wasn't just precaution, it was the only chance we had to continue. Finally, as we cleared the canyon, the glow of the creatures faded behind us, replaced by shadows stretching into the unbroken darkness ahead. My partner exhaled shakily, eyes darting nervously, realizing that we had survived only by following the rule. I felt a fleeting sense of relief, tempered by the knowledge that the trench had noticed our attention, that some part of it now remembered our curiosity. And just as I allowed a tentative sigh, a massive shadow surged from the darkness above, moving faster than anything natural, and I knew that obeying Rule 7 hadn't guaranteed safety, it had only delayed what was coming. As the massive shadow surged past, I felt a deep, instinctual fear settle in my chest, and immediately remembered Rule 8. My partner's hand twitched near the controls, the urge to respond, to somehow signal back, burning in his eyes. I gripped his arm firmly, whispering, "Don't, we can't. Rule 8 exists, because they notice even the smallest acknowledgement." The trench seemed to hum around us, currents rippling, as if sensing every micro-movement, every twitch of curiosity, testing our resolve. I could feel our isolation pressing against the hull, an invisible weight that reminded us we were nothing in this vast abyss. The submersible rocked slightly as currents shifted, shadows flickering across the walls in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost intelligent. My partner whispered nervously, "What if it's trying to communicate, trying to tell us something?" I shook my head, voice low and tense. That's exactly what Rule 8 warns against. They are not like us. Any attempt to communicate could provoke them. The abyss seemed alive, pulsing with awareness, and I could feel my heart racing, realizing that breaking this rule even once could turn our curiosity into a trap from which there was no escape. As we maneuvered through a narrow canyon, strange shapes twisted in the darkness around us, their glowing forms flickering in pulses that almost seemed like Morse code. I forced my partner to avert his gaze, knowing that any response, any attempt to interact, could draw attention. My fingers hovered over the console, tension so thick it was almost physical. "We can't answer," I whispered, glancing at him. The trench seemed to hum, subtle currents brushing against the hull in patterns that mirrored the pulses of the creatures. A silent reminder that Rule 8 was about maintaining distance, preserving our anonymity in a world that could erase us without hesitation. A sudden surge of water pushed us sideways, nudging the submersible closer to one of the glowing creatures. My partner's eyes widened in fascination, and he murmured, "Do you think it understands us?" I pressed my hand over his arm, restraining him physically as much as mentally. "Do not engage. Never attempt communication. Rule 8 is the line we cannot cross." The trench seemed to respond to even our thoughts, currents twisting like fingers around the hull, reminding us that this was not just a place, but a presence, aware of every small infraction. We drifted cautiously, the creatures weaving around us, glowing in unpredictable rhythms. I could feel my partner trembling, the weight of isolation and fear pressing on him, his curiosity battling survival instinct. I feel like it wants something from us," he whispered. I shook my head silently, knowing that the abyss didn't want understanding, it wanted attention, and attention could be lethal. Rule 8 was our shield, the only barrier between observation and provocation, and the trench's pulse seemed to echo the importance of that boundary. The submersible tilted slightly as a current shifted unexpectedly, sending debris swirling past. Shadows stretched unnaturally, elongated by the flickering lights of the bioluminescent creatures, and I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. My partner's voice quivered. What if it's trying to warn us? I grabbed the controls firmly, forcing him to focus on navigation. It's testing us. That's all. Any attempt to respond is dangerous. Rule 8 is absolute, I said. The trench seemed to pulse in agreement, or perhaps in anticipation of our next move, and I realized that silence and obedience were the only ways to survive. We moved deeper into the canyon, currents swirling violently, almost as if the trench was guiding us, herding us along paths it chose. The glowing creatures twisted and pulsed around us, patterns shifting faster, seemingly measuring our reactions. My partner's hands clenched the console, face pale, whispering, "I can't stop thinking about what it wants." I pressed a hand to his shoulder, guiding him forward, silently repeating Rule 8 in my mind. Communication, even through thought or gesture, was dangerous. It would mark us as intruders, and the trench did not forgive intrusions. The canyon opened into a wider plateau, but the water pressure shifted subtly, currents brushing against the hull in deliberate patterns. My partner leaned closer to the viewport, whispering. I almost wanted to speak to it, just to see what would happen. I gritted my teeth, gripping his arm. That's exactly why Rule 8 exists. Any interaction could be fatal. You can't risk it. The shadows flickered across the walls like living silhouettes, and I could feel the trench pressing in, its awareness a palpable weight on every inch of the submersible. A sudden ripple in the distance made both of us flinch, and the creature's glow intensified, pulsing rapidly, almost as if signaling something we were not meant to understand. My partner's lips moved as if to respond, but I grabbed his hands, holding them tightly. The trench seemed to hum around us, a vibration in the water that resonated with the glowing pulses. I realized that obeying Rule 8 wasn't just about restraint. It was about survival, hiding and maintaining a boundary that the abyss demanded we respect. Finally, as we navigated past the plateau, the creature's light receded slightly, leaving the shadows of the trench stretching into the unbroken darkness ahead. My partner exhaled shakily, understanding that survival required obedience, and I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But as I allowed a cautious glance forward, I saw a massive shape emerging from the darkness, enormous and deliberate, moving with intent. I knew that the trench had been watching us test Rule 8, and that whatever was coming next would punish even the smallest lapse in vigilance. The massive shape loomed just beyond the dim lights, and my stomach churned with dread as I recalled Rule 9. Unexplored crevices in the trench were more than mere gaps in rock. They were traps, hiding horrors that defied understanding. My partner's gaze flicked toward a narrow tunnel branching off from the main path. "Maybe we should just check it quickly," he whispered, curiosity trembling in his voice. I pressed my hand on his shoulder, forcing him to focus. "No, Rule 9 exists for a reason. Those gaps are not safe. They're alive with danger we can't predict." The trench pressed around us, dark and immense, as if aware of our hesitation. We continued forward, submersible lights cutting jagged paths through the darkness, the massive shadow still gliding behind us silently. Shadows twisted in the corners of the walls, creatures glimmering in the periphery, but the uncharted tunnel beckoned like a siren. I forced my partner to avert his eyes, repeating the logic of Rule 9 in my mind. Even the slightest detour into unknown territory could awaken things that had been waiting for intruders, and I felt the trench vibrating subtly, warning us that curiosity had a price. The currents shifted as we moved, nudging the submersible toward the crevice just slightly, and my partner's fingers twitched toward the controls. "Just a peek," he murmured, barely audible. I gritted my teeth and held the joystick steady, guiding us away from the tunnel. Rule 9 wasn't just precautionary. It was a boundary drawn by the trench itself, a line between survival and being claimed by the darkness. Shadows seemed to pulse at the entrance, almost beckoning, and I could feel a cold presence lurking beyond, waiting for anyone foolish enough to cross the line. We passed the crevice, but the pressure in the water shifted subtly, currents brushing harder against the hull, as though the trench was punishing even our glance. My partner shivered, whispering, "I can feel something inside it, watching." I nodded silently, understanding fully that Rule 9 meant no observation, no curiosity, nothing. The trench was alive in ways we couldn't comprehend, and unexplored gaps weren't just tunnels. They were entrances to something older, something patient, something hungry. Every pulse of water around us seemed heavier, deliberate, as if the abyss remembered every thought we entertained. The narrow canyon twisted further, shadows flickering in patterns that almost mimicked our own movements. My partner kept glancing nervously toward other potential crevices, the allure of discovery battling his terror. I gripped his arm tightly, murmuring a reminder of Rule 9, understanding that even passive curiosity could be fatal. The trench seemed to respond, currents twisting more violently, as if testing our resolve, reminding us that survival wasn't about bravery, it was about obedience. Each moment of hesitation brought with it the sensation that something immense was inching closer, unseen but deliberate. Suddenly, a ripple of displaced water brushed the submersible, subtle yet insistent, and I realized that the trench itself was punishing even our attention to these gaps. Shadows shifted unnaturally, shapes sliding just beyond the reach of our lights, and I felt a wave of primal fear. My partner whispered shakily, "It's like it knows what we're thinking." Every glance, I nodded grimly, pressing my hands against the console. Rule 9 wasn't just about avoiding physical danger, it was about avoiding recognition, acknowledgement by the abyss that could follow us indefinitely. We navigated through a narrow canyon, currents twisting violently, and the submersible rocked with the force of unseen pressures. Creatures we had passed earlier pulsed around us in erratic patterns, as if aware of the tension in our movements. My partner's hands clenched the controls, his curiosity and fear warring silently, and I knew that exploring even one uncharted crevice could lead to instant disaster. I reminded him again softly of Rule 9, guiding the craft carefully, steering away from the tempting shadows, understanding that the trench measured every misstep. A sudden flash of light flickered deep within the distance of the canyon, perhaps from a reflective object, perhaps from something alive. My partner gasped, lips moving as though to speak, but I gripped his shoulder and shook my head, whispering again about Rule 9. The trench's presence was unmistakable now, subtle but overwhelming, a sensation that wrapped around the submersible like a vice. Even glancing toward the crevice had consequences. The water shifted violently, and I felt something massive brush past below us, unseen but terrifying. We pressed forward through the canyon, shadows twisting unnaturally along the walls, currents pressing and tugging, testing our attention to detail. My partner's face was pale, eyes wide, and he finally whispered, "I won't look again. I understand now." I nodded silently, focusing on keeping us steady, but the trench seemed to hum with an intelligence we could not comprehend. Rule 9 had saved us again, but the warning lingered. The abyss had not forgiven our curiosity, and the massive presence that followed was patient, deliberate, and relentless. Finally, as the canyon opened into a wider plateau, the water calmed slightly, though tension still vibrated through the submersible. My partner exhaled shakily, acknowledging silently that the trench's rules were not suggestions. Shadows stretched into unbroken darkness ahead, and I realized that obeying Rule 9 had only delayed what was waiting for us. A low, undulating movement in the distance suggested that the trench remembered our attention, that the consequences of even minor curiosity were far from over. I could feel the next choice we made shaping the dangers that awaited us just ahead. The plateau stretched ahead, shadowed and silent, and I felt a creeping unease as I remembered Rule 10. My partner, exhausted and trembling, leaned toward the console and muttered, "Maybe we could save power. Just turn them off for a moment." I grabbed his shoulder, voice firm. "No, Rule 10 exists, because darkness in the trench isn't empty. Even a second without light could leave us vulnerable to things we can't see or predict." The water pressed around us, thick with unseen eyes, and I felt the submersible vibrate, as though the trench itself sensed our hesitation. As we moved forward, the lights illuminated eerie silhouettes along the canyon walls, jagged rock formations, distorted by the faint glow of bioluminescent creatures. My partner swallowed hard, his gaze darting nervously toward the shadows. "It feels like something's waiting in the dark," he whispered. I nodded grimly, gripping the controls. Rule 10 wasn't just precaution. The trench used darkness to its advantage, concealing predators, currents, and entities that thrived in unseen spaces. A single lapse could turn exploration into entrapment, and the weight of that thought pressed heavily in the cabin. We navigated the plateau carefully, the submersible's lights piercing only a fraction of the abyss. Shadows shifted unnaturally, flickering in ways that made the walls seem alive. My partner's curiosity flared dangerously, fingers twitching near the switches. "Maybe it's safe if we just go dark for a second," he whispered. I shook my head, whispering, "Do not turn them off. Rule 10 is survival. Darkness isn't empty. It's the trench itself watching and waiting." I felt the currents intensify, subtle but deliberate, as if the abyss was reinforcing the rule, reminding us that even a minor lapse could be fatal. A ripple in the water nudged the submersible sideways, and the shadows stretched in impossible directions, teasing the edges of the lights. My partner flinched, muttering under his breath, "I can feel it moving in the dark." I pressed my hands firmly on the console, guiding us through carefully, whispering again that obeying Rule 10 was non-negotiable. The trench seemed to hum, the vibrations against the hull echoing the urgency of maintaining light. I realized that the darkness wasn't merely absence. It was an active force, aware of us, capable of manipulating everything we thought was solid or safe. The submersible tilted slightly, as currents shifted violently, throwing shadows across the walls in chaotic, almost sentient patterns. Bioluminescent creatures flickered erratically in the distance, reflecting the tension in the water. My partner whispered, voice trembling, "What if they can see us better in the dark?" I shook my head firmly. Rule 10 flashed in my mind. Darkness revealed nothing to us, but it revealed everything about us to the trench. Every shadow could conceal movement, far larger and faster than we could comprehend, and turning off the lights would strip us of even the illusion of control. We moved cautiously, currents twisting and tugging, the submersible rocking under invisible pressures. Shadows stretched into impossible shapes, the faint glow of distant creatures barely illuminating the space ahead. My partner's hands shook as he adjusted controls, almost tempted to experiment with the lights. I grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, "Do not even think about it. Darkness is not safe. Rule 10 exists to keep us alive." The trench seemed to pulse around us, aware of our compliance, and I could feel the invisible weight of entities lurking just beyond the glow. A sudden shift in current sent us skimming close to jagged rock formations, the lights catching faint reflections in the sediment. Shapes flickered like living silhouettes, moving in ways that defied logic. My partner gasped, voice low and strained, "It's like something's right there, but I can't see it fully." I nodded silently, gripping the controls tighter. Rule 10 was the line between being aware and being consumed. Darkness was not absence. It was presence, a living, breathing awareness that could engulf anything foolish enough to surrender to it. The plateau narrowed into a canyon, shadows flickering across the walls, currents nudging the submersible with deliberate, almost playful intent. My partner's curiosity flared dangerously again, his gaze darting toward the edges of the lights. I pressed my hand against his arm, murmuring the importance of Rule 10, knowing that our survival depended on maintaining every ounce of visibility. The trench seemed to pulse in response, currents wrapping subtly around the hull like warning hands, reminding us that even temporary darkness could invite disaster. As we drifted further, I noticed faint shapes beneath the submersible, moving faster than the currents should allow. My partner whispered shakily, "I think they're following us." I didn't answer immediately, focusing on navigation, gripping the controls with sweat-slicked palms. Rule 10 had never felt so urgent. The lights were the only barrier between us and the things in the water that thrived in shadows. I felt a pulse through the hull, deliberate and unyielding, and I knew the trench was testing our compliance, aware of every flicker of hesitation. Finally, the plateau opened into a wider expanse, the water slightly calmer, but still vibrating with tension. My partner exhaled shakily, understanding that obeying Rule 10 wasn't optional, it was survival. I glanced at the shadows stretching into the unbroken darkness ahead, and I realized that the trench had marked us, that the weight of even minor hesitation would follow us into the next challenge. And just as I allowed myself a fraction of relief, a massive movement surged from the abyss, swift and deliberate, reminding us that obeying Rule 10 hadn't guaranteed safety. It had only postponed the consequences of the trench's awareness. As the submersible hovered above the abyss, currents tugging gently against the hull, I remembered Rule 11 with a sinking sense of dread. Every second we spent stationary was a second the trench could observe, record, and react. My partner swallowed hard, muttering, "I thought we were safe. I just needed a moment." I pressed a hand against his arm, whispering, "No. Rule 11 isn't a suggestion. The trench notices hesitation. Standing still is as dangerous as touching the wrong thing, looking at the wrong eyes, or ignoring a current." A subtle vibration ran through the hull, almost like a heartbeat, and I felt the weight of unseen observers pressing down from all sides. We moved cautiously forward, each flicker of our lights illuminating shadows that twisted in impossible ways. My partner's fingers twitched on the controls as he glanced repeatedly toward glowing creatures hovering near the walls. I reminded him again, silently, that Rule 11 demanded constant movement, awareness, and decisiveness. The trench itself seemed alive, its currents shifting subtly to test our compliance, nudging us toward paths that were both safe and terrifying. Every pause could be observed, every hesitation amplified into consequences we couldn't imagine. The abyss stretched endlessly below and around us, shadows flickering, shapes moving in ways that defied logic. I could feel my heart hammering in rhythm with the subtle pulse of the trench, every beat a reminder that stagnation was danger. My partner whispered shakily, It's like it knows when we hesitate." I nodded grimly, gripping the controls. The submersible rocked slightly under invisible currents, and I realized that Rule 11 wasn't just about physical survival. It was about psychological endurance, about proving to the trench that we were not weak, that we obeyed, and that we respected its rules. As we navigated a narrow canyon, currents twisting violently, shadows flickering with the glow of bioluminescent creatures, I could feel the tension pressing on us like an invisible weight. My partner's gaze flicked repeatedly toward a narrow crevice we had passed earlier, curiosity warring with fear. I pressed his shoulder, murmuring the importance of Rule 11. The trench seemed to respond, currents swirling more aggressively, as though aware of our slightest hesitation. Each second we lingered could attract attention from the unseen forces that thrived in the darkness beyond our lights. Suddenly, a massive shadow surged from the distance, moving with unnatural grace through the glowing creatures. My partner flinched, muttering, I can't stay calm." I gripped the controls tighter, forcing him to maintain focus. Rule 11 demanded that we move, that we stay aware, that we never give the trench a reason to notice us beyond necessity. The abyss pulsed around us, subtle currents brushing against the hull, whispering warnings we could feel more than hear. Even a fraction of hesitation now could mark us permanently, and I could sense that the trench was watching every microsecond of our obedience. The canyon narrowed further, the glow of distant creatures reflecting in impossible patterns across the walls. My partner's hands shook over the controls, his curiosity warring with his fear. I think it wants us to stop," he whispered. I pressed my hand firmly on his shoulder, guiding the submersible through, murmuring silently, "Do not linger. Rule 11 is absolute." The trench seemed to tighten around us, currents pressing harder, shadows stretching longer, as if to remind us that hesitation was a signal the abyss would never forgive. A sudden surge in pressure rocked the submersible, and shapes moved faster in the distance, too fast to identify, too deliberate to ignore. My partner's face was pale behind the mask, eyes wide with fear. I gritted my teeth, forcing steady control over the craft. The weight of Rule 11 pressed on me like a physical force. The trench didn't just notice hesitation, it punished it. Every second we lingered could invite observation, aggression, or worse. Currents twisted in patterns that seemed almost intelligent, nudging us forward, testing our compliance. As we emerged onto a wider plateau, the trench's shadow stretched across the water in impossible forms, the bioluminescent creatures pulsing as if counting our every motion. My partner whispered shakily, I feel it following us." I nodded silently, focusing on maintaining constant movement, understanding that standing still, even for a moment, could doom us. The trench's awareness felt tangible now, currents pressing against the submersible like invisible hands. Rule 11 was not a guideline, it was a mandate enforced by forces older and more patient than we could imagine. We drifted cautiously across the plateau, submersible lights cutting through the darkness, shadows flickering in mesmerizing, unnatural patterns. My partner's breathing grew shallow, panic rising despite my attempts to steady him. I reminded him silently that Rule 11 demanded movement, vigilance, and decisiveness. The abyss seemed alive with attention, currents brushing against the hull, guiding, nudging, testing our resolve. Any delay, any hesitation, and I knew we would feel the consequences, though I didn't yet know what form they would take. Finally, as the plateau stretched ahead into unbroken darkness, I felt the weight of the trench like a living entity, pressing from all sides. My partner exhaled shakily, realizing that constant movement was not just precaution, it was survival. I glanced ahead at the shadows stretching into the abyss, aware that obeying Rule 11 had not guaranteed safety. The currents shifted subtly, deliberate, intelligent, and I knew that what awaited us next would punish even a fraction of hesitation. And as I guided the submersible forward, I understood the terrifying truth. The trench notices everything, and the consequences of lingering could follow us forever, unseen and unstoppable. If you enjoyed this story, like, share and subscribe for more.